Ziera had always believed that humans were nothing more than savages. The Xelveni Empire had taught her that Earth was a primitive, violent world, a planet barely worth considering in the vastness of the galaxy. So when the Galactic Council assigned her an inspection mission to Earth, she wasn't pleased. But she was prepared. Ziara boarded her sleek, black reconnaissance ship, armed with the most advanced weapons and cloaking technology that Xelveni Empire had to offer. She had no plans to stay long, just observe the humans, gather data, and return. But the moment she entered Earth's atmosphere, everything went wrong. Her ship's cloaking device started to malfunction. Human satellites, which she'd been told were outdated and ineffective, somehow detected her presence. Alarms blared across her control panel, and within moments, defensive missiles launched from the planet below. Ziara's heart pounded as she tried to evade them, but the missiles were fast and precise. One struck her ship's left wing, sending it into a violent spin. She fought the controls, but it was no use. Flames erupted from the engine, and the ship hurtled toward the planet's surface. She crashed into a dense forest with a deafening impact. The trees splintered, and dirt exploded into the air as the ship carved a burning trail through the landscape. When everything finally went still, Zara groaned in pain. Her body ached, but she was alive. Barely, she stumbled out of the wreckage, her sleek silver armor scratched and dented. The environment around her was unlike anything she had expected. The air was thick and humid, the scent of earth and vegetation strong. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, shrill cries, rustling leaves, distant roars. She activated her scanner, but it flickered weakly. The crash had damaged more than she realized. She was stranded. Then the growling started. Ziara turned slowly, her hand going to the energy pistol at her waist. From the shadows, a creature emerged, massive and unlike anything described in her briefings. It had dark, scaly skin, glowing yellow eyes, and rows of jagged teeth. The predator circled her, muscles coiled, and ready to strike. Ziara raised her weapon, but before she could fire, the beast lunged. A gunshot rang out. The creature collapsed mid-leap, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. Ziara spun, weapon still raised, and found herself facing a human. He stood a few feet away, holding an old-fashioned projectile weapon, a rifle. His clothes were rugged and worn, his face streaked with dirt. Despite his rough appearance, there was a calm confidence in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. Ziara didn't lower her weapon. "Stay back," she warned. The man raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Easy. I just saved your life." She didn't trust him. Everything she'd been taught about humans told her they were dangerous. Yet this one had just rescued her. Before she could decide what to do, dizziness washed over her. The damage from the crash, combined with her injuries, was too much. Darkness closed in, and she collapsed. When Zara woke, she was in a small wooden cabin. The air smelled of smoke and something cooking. Pain throbbed through her body, but her wounds had been cleaned and bandaged. She sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The human sat nearby, stirring a pot over a fire. "You're awake," he said without looking at her. "That's good." She studied him warily. "Who are you?" "David," he replied simply. "And you?" She hesitated. "Ziara." "Well, Ziara," he said with a slight smile, "you're lucky I found you when I did. That thing would have torn you apart." Over the next few days, Zara recovered. Despite her distrust, David never threatened her. He brought her food and water, kept the fire going, and even gave her his own blanket when the nights grew cold. She couldn't understand it. He had nothing to gain by helping her. As she regained her strength, Zara began exploring the forest around the cabin. The wildlife was both beautiful and terrifying, the environment harsh yet vibrant. David guided her, teaching her how to navigate the terrain and avoid danger. Slowly, her fear of him began to fade. One afternoon, they sat by a small stream. David skipped a stone across the water, watching it bounce with an easy smile. Zara watched him, curious. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "That's not logical," she said. "Maybe not," he agreed, "but it's human." That night, the danger returned. A sleek, black Selveni drone hovered above the trees, scanning the area with a cold blue light. Zara's breath caught. She knew what that meant. The killed squad had been sent to retrieve her, or eliminate her. "We have to go," she said urgently. David didn't question her. They packed quickly, moving through the forest with practiced speed. But the drones were relentless. By morning, the squad had found them. The attack was swift and brutal. Energy blasts tore through the trees as Zara and David fought side by side. Her advanced weaponry combined with his sharp instincts made them a formidable team. But the squad had numbers on their side. When one of the soldiers took aim at Zara, David threw himself in front of her. The blast struck him in the side, and he went down with a pained cry. Rage and fear surged through Zara. She fired back, taking down the attacker with a precise shot. Then she was at David's side, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Why did you do that?" she demanded. He smiled weakly. Seemed like the right thing to do. Using her alien medkit, Zara stabilized him. But the squad wasn't done. They were closing in, and she knew they wouldn't stop until both of them were dead. "We can't win this," David said, his voice strained. "We don't have to," Zara replied. She had a plan. They made their way to a nearby communications tower. Zara hacked into the system, sending a false signal to the Selveni mothership. The squad's orders changed, pulling them away from the hunt. It bought them time, but not much. As they rested in a small cave, David looked at her. "You didn't have to save me," he said softly. "Seemed like the right thing to do," she replied with a small smile. But their fight wasn't over. The mothership prepared for an orbital strike, ready to erase any trace of their failure. Zara made a choice. She wouldn't let it happen. With David's help, she infiltrated the ship. The battle was fierce, but they fought with everything they had. At the heart of the ship, they reached the control room. "We have to destroy it," Zara said. David nodded. "Set the charges. I'll hold them off." "No," she said firmly. "We do this together." As the ship exploded around them, they made their escape. The strike was canceled, and Earth was safe, but the cost was high. Back on the planet, Zara faced exile for her betrayal. The Selveni Empire would never welcome her back. But when she looked at David, bruised, battered, but alive, she knew she had found something more valuable than her home. As they stood together, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, David took her hand. "Welcome to Earth," he said softly. For the first time, Zara smiled. She had come to Earth expecting to find savages. Instead, she had found a new home and a new heart. David didn't waste any time once Zara woke up. He could see she was still weak, and the strange armor she wore only confirmed what he already suspected. She wasn't from around here. But there was no time for questions. The growling sound in the forest hadn't stopped. And now, with the added threat of whatever had knocked her ship out of the sky, staying put was dangerous. "Come on," he said, helping her up. "We need to get out of here." Zara hesitated but didn't resist. Despite everything she'd been taught about humans, David hadn't harmed her. In fact, he had saved her life. She was still suspicious. But for now, survival was more important than suspicion. She followed him through the dense forest, her body aching with every step. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing where an old off-road vehicle was parked. David helped her into the passenger seat and started the engine. The vehicle rumbled to life, and they sped away from the crash site. Zara kept glancing back, expecting pursuit, but the forest remained still. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. "Safe house," David replied, his eyes focused on the road. "It's not far, but we need to lay low until we figure out what's going on." Zara didn't answer. She was too busy processing everything. Earth wasn't what she had expected. The environment was harsh but beautiful, and David's behavior was nothing like the aggression and savagery she had been told to expect from humans. When they finally reached the safe house, Zara was surprised again. It was a simple wooden cabin nestled at the edge of a lake, surrounded by towering trees and the soft sounds of wildlife. The air smelled fresh, and the water shimmered under the sun. It was peaceful. David helped her inside, and she collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. He moved around the cabin with practiced ease, lighting a fire and preparing food. The warmth of the fire and the simple comforts of the cabin made her feel more at ease than she had in days. As she rested, Zara couldn't help but watch David. He moved with quiet strength and calm efficiency. There was a gentleness in his actions that didn't match the violent image she had of humans, and when he finally set a bowl of hot stew in front of her, she hesitated before taking a bite. The flavors were simple but comforting, and for the first time, she felt a strange sense of safety. But the peace didn't last. Late that night, David's radio crackled to life with a warning. "Unidentified aircraft sighted near the crash site. Military's been scrambled, but these aren't ours. Stay low." Zara's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what that meant. That Selveni Empire's elite kill squad was here. They would assume she'd been captured and eliminate anyone who stood in their way. "We have to leave," she said urgently. David didn't argue. They packed quickly, and within minutes, they were back on the road. The night stretched on as they drove through winding mountain paths and dense forests. Every shadow felt like a threat, and every distant sound made Zara's heart race. At dawn, they stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley. David sat beside her, his rifle resting across his knees. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, the danger felt distant. "Why are they after you?" David asked quietly. Zara hesitated. Trust didn't come easily, but he had saved her life more than once. "They think you captured me," she finally said. "That Selveni don't tolerate failure. They'll kill anyone in their way." He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Then we'd better make sure they don't find us." As they continued their journey, Zara began to see more of Earth, and more of its people. They passed through small towns and remote settlements, and everywhere she looked, she saw resilience and kindness. Humans helped each other, fought for their families, and protected their homes. It was nothing like the barbaric image she had been taught. David's protective nature only reinforced that. Every time danger threatened, he put himself between her and harm without hesitation. He was fearless and determined, and despite her training, Zara found herself drawn to his strength. One night, as they camped under the stars, Zara finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "Why do you keep helping me?" David looked at her, his expression soft. "Because it's the right thing to do." She frowned. "But you don't know me. I could be your enemy." He smiled slightly. "You haven't given me a reason to believe that." Before she could respond, the sound of engines shattered the quiet night. The kill squad had found them. They ran, weaving through the trees as energy blasts tore through the foliage. David fired back with his rifle, taking down one of the pursuers, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Zara's advanced weapon hummed in her hand, and she fought with the precision of her training. Together, they made a formidable team. But then David was hit. The blast knocked him to the ground, and Zara's heart stopped. She dropped to his side, her hands pressing against the wound. "Stay with me," she begged. "I'm okay," he gasped, though his face was pale. "Just get us out of here." With adrenaline driving her, Zara managed to drag him into a nearby cave. She used her limited medical supplies to stabilize him, but they were running out of options. The kill squad was closing in, and David was too injured to run. "I'll distract them," he said through gritted teeth. "No," Zara said fiercely. "I'm not leaving you." She activated her communicator, sending a false signal that drew the squad away from their location. It bought them time, but not much. They needed a way off the planet. With David barely able to stand, they made their way to an old communications tower. Ziara hacked into the system, sending a distress signal to any nearby ships. The response was immediate, but it wasn't friendly. The Selvani mothership was preparing an orbital strike. "We have to stop them," Ziara said. David nodded. "Then let's do it." They infiltrated the mothership together, fighting through the corridors with a combination of skill and desperation. The ship was a maze of cold metal and harsh lights, but they pressed on. At the core, Ziara set the charges while David covered her. When the ship's alarms began to blare, she knew their time was up. "We need to go," she shouted. They barely made it to the escape pods before the ship exploded. The shockwave rattled the pod, but when they finally broke through the atmosphere and landed safely on Earth, relief washed over them. The danger was over. For now. As they stood on the shores of the lake near David's safe house, Zara looked out at the water. She had come to Earth expecting a mission. Instead, she had found a new perspective and a new purpose. When David reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. "Welcome home," he said softly. The night air was cold and still, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an animal. David and Ziara moved quickly through the dense forest, their footsteps light and careful. The safe house was no longer an option. The kill squad had found them. They needed to stay ahead, but both of them knew the enemy wouldn't stop until Ziara was either captured or dead. Ziara's heart pounded in her chest. She'd never felt fear like this before. The Selveni Empire's elite kill squads were known for their efficiency and ruthlessness. They would burn the entire forest down if it meant eliminating a perceived threat. And now David was caught in the crossfire. Because of her. "We're not gonna make it far like this," David said quietly. He glanced at her, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "We need higher ground, a place we can defend." She nodded, trying to ignore the tightness in her throat. David had been nothing but brave and selfless since the moment they met. And now, because of her people's paranoia, he was risking his life. They moved fast, climbing a rocky slope that overlooked the forest. From here, they could see the faint glow of searchlights moving through the trees. The kill squad was getting closer. David knelt down, adjusting his rifle. "When they get here, stay behind me." "No," Ziara said fiercely. "I fight too." He looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. But there was no time to argue. The first shots rang out. Bursts of bright, deadly energy streaking through the night. David fired back, his aim precise, and Ziara raised her own weapon, the alien technology humming with power. The kill squad moved in fast and hard. They wore advanced combat armor, their movements coordinated and efficient, but David was a soldier, and Ziara was trained for war. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Ziara's plasma shots tore through the trees, forcing the enemy to take cover. David picked them off one by one with his rifle, his calm and focus never wavering. But the killed squad kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. A figure broke through the underbrush, rushing toward them with a blade glowing with energy. David turned, firing, but he wasn't fast enough. Ziara saw the attacker first. Without thinking, she threw herself in front of David, her weapon discharging in a brilliant flash. The enemy fell, but not before getting off a final shot. The sound of the gunfire was deafening. David stumbled back, his face twisting in pain as blood bloomed across his side. "No!" Ziara's heart stopped. She caught him as he fell, her arms wrapping around his broad frame. His weight was heavy against her, and the sight of his blood made her breath catch. "Stay with me," she whispered, panic rising. "I'm fine," he gritted out, though his face was pale. "We have to. Keep fighting." But Ziara wasn't listening. She couldn't let him die. Not like this. She reached into her pack, pulling out her advanced medkit. The Tselvanni Empire's technology was far beyond anything Earth had, and using it on a human was strictly forbidden. But she didn't care. "Hold still," she said, her voice shaking. The medkit hissed as it activated, and she pressed it against his wound. The device worked fast, sealing the injury and sending healing agents through his system. David's breathing slowed, his face relaxing as the pain faded. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured, his eyes half-lidded. "Yes, I did," she whispered, her throat tight. "You saved me. Now I save you." But there was no time for relief. The kill squad was closing in, their shouts growing louder. Ziara gripped her weapon, ready to defend them both. David pushed himself up, his strength slowly returning. "We fight together," he said, his voice firm. They stood back to back, their weapons ready, and when the enemy finally broke through the trees, they unleashed everything they had. The battle was brutal. Energy blasts and gunfire lit up the night, and the air was filled with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. But Ziara and David fought with a fierce determination, him with his human grit and skill, and her with the advanced tech and training of the Tselvanni Empire. But even their combined strength wasn't enough. The kill squad kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Just when it seemed like they would be overwhelmed, a new sound filled the air, the distant roar of engines. Reinforcements, but whose? Ziara's heart leaped when she saw the ship descending. It wasn't Tselvanni, it was human. David's people had found them. The killed squad fell back, realizing they were outnumbered. Within moments, the forest was filled with human soldiers, their weapons forcing the Tselvanni into retreat. When the last of the killed squad disappeared into the night, Ziara finally allowed herself to breathe. "You did good," David said softly, his voice warm despite his exhaustion. "You too," she replied, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time she smiled. As the human soldiers secured the area, Ziara sat beside David, the weight of everything that had happened settling on her shoulders. She had come to Earth expecting savagery and chaos. Instead, she had found kindness, bravery, and sacrifice. She had found David. "Thank you," she whispered. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Anytime." And for the first time, Ziara knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow against the cool night. David sat nearby, his rifle within arm's reach, while Ziara stared into the flames. The battle had been over for hours, but the weight of everything still pressed down on her. The fear, the fighting, and David's wound had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. But more than that, it was the realization that had begun to take root in her mind. Everything she had been taught about humans was wrong. "You okay?" David's voice was gentle, breaking through her thoughts. She looked at him, his face illuminated by the firelight. There was concern in his eyes, for her, even after everything he had been through. The humans were supposed to be savage, selfish, and dangerous. But this man, he had risked his life for her more than once. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "Your people, you fight so fiercely. You protect even those who are not your own. Why?" David shrugged, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's just what we do. We fight for the people we care about. We fight for what's right." Ziara's chest tightened. She had seen his bravery firsthand, his willingness to throw himself into danger without hesitation. And now she felt something she had never expected: admiration. But that admiration was laced with fear. She knew what was coming. The Tselvanni wouldn't let this incident go unanswered. As if summoned by her thoughts, her communicator beeped. She hesitated before answering, knowing whatever message waited would not be good. The face of High Commander Vorik appeared on the screen, his expression cold and severe. "Ziara," he said, "you have failed in your mission. You allowed yourself to be compromised." She stiffened. "I was attacked. The kill squad was." Silence, Vorik snapped. We have received reports of your sympathy toward these humans. This is unacceptable. Ziara's heart sank. She had suspected they were watching, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel even more dire. The Galactic Council has deemed humanity a threat, Vorik continued. Their defiance cannot be tolerated. An orbital bombardment has been authorized. Earth will be cleansed. The words hit her like a physical blow. No, she burst out, unable to contain her horror. You can't. This is not your decision, Vorik said sharply. Your loyalty is to the Empire, or have you forgotten? The transmission ended, and the silence that followed was suffocating. David was watching her, his brow furrowed. What's going on? He asked. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. The weight of the choice before her was crushing. She had spent her entire life serving the Selveni Empire, believing in their vision of order and superiority. But now she had seen something different. A people who fought not for conquest, but for survival and each other. Her voice trembled. They're going to destroy your planet. David's face went pale. What? An orbital bombardment, she whispered. They'll wipe out your civilization. Everyone you love. Gone. The fire crackled between them, but neither of them moved. The reality of what she had just said hung heavy in the air. We have to stop them, David said finally, his voice hard and determined. We can't let them do this. But Zara knew how powerful the Selveni fleet was. Earth's defenses wouldn't stand a chance. I can't stop them, she said, her voice cracking. But maybe I can delay them. David's eyes met hers. Then we fight. The hours that followed were a blur. Zara transmitted false reports, stalling the fleet's advance while David gathered his people. The human resistance was small, under-equipped, but they had heart. When the first Selveni ships appeared in the sky, the world held its breath. Zara stood beside David on the front lines, her weapon ready. She had made her choice. She would fight for Earth. She would fight for him. The cold metallic corridors of the Selveni mothership stretched ahead, silent and ominous. The dim blue lights cast long shadows as Zara and David moved carefully, their steps light but quick. The air was thick with tension. Every second they stayed here increased the risk of being caught. Zara's heart pounded against her ribs. She had been on this ship before, but never like this. Never as an enemy. And certainly never with someone like David by her side. Which way? David whispered, his voice barely audible. She glanced at her wrist device, scanning the layout of the ship. Left. The control room is just ahead. They moved swiftly, but the silence was shattered by the sudden whirring of drones. Zara's eyes widened as the spherical machines descended from the ceiling, their red sensors locking onto them. Run, she hissed. The corridor erupted in gunfire. David's rifle barked out bursts of energy, and Zara fired her sleek alien weapon with deadly precision. But the drones were fast, too fast. One shot grazed David's shoulder, and he bit back, a cry of pain. No. Zara spun, taking down the drone before it could fire again. She grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. We're almost there. They burst through the control room doors, sealing them behind them. Alarms blared, and Zara's fingers flew over the console, trying to override the ship's systems. Come on, she muttered. Zara, behind you. She turned just in time to see a Selveni soldier burst in. David tackled him without hesitation, the two of them crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Zara's heart raced as she watched them struggle, until David delivered a swift, brutal punch that knocked the soldier out cold. Breathing hard, David stood up. We don't have much time. She nodded, her fingers moving faster. Finally, the screen blinked green. The self-destruct sequence is ready, but it has to be activated manually from the core. David's jaw tightened. Then let's go. The journey to the core was even more dangerous. The ship was on high alert, and they fought their way through wave after wave of Selveni soldiers and AI drones. By the time they reached the core, they were both battered and exhausted. "This is it," Zara said, looking at the massive pulsating structure before them. "Once we activate it, we'll only have minutes to get out." David's eyes softened as he looked at her. "You've done enough, Zara. You need to go." Her stomach dropped. "What?" "I'll activate the self-destruct," he said. "You get back to the escape pod." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you." He cupped her face gently. "If this ship doesn't go down, Earth is finished. You know that." Tears welled in her eyes. She had never felt this way before. This raw, aching fear of losing someone. "Please, David." He kissed her. It was fierce and desperate, filled with everything they didn't have time to say. When he pulled back, his eyes were soft but determined. "Go," he whispered. Before she could argue, he turned and ran toward the core's control panel. Zara's heart shattered, but she knew he was right. She forced herself to run, even as tears streamed down her face. The ship began to shake violently as the self-destruct sequence initiated, and she barely made it to the escape pod in time. As the pod launched into space, the Selveni mothership exploded behind her, a brilliant, terrible burst of light, and David was gone. The silence of space stretched endlessly around the small cloaked ship as it drifted toward the wreckage. Zara's hands gripped the controls tightly, her eyes scanning the field of twisted metal and debris that had once been the Selveni mothership. The destruction was complete, and yet her heart refused to accept what everyone else had already declared. David was gone. The official reports from the Galactic Council had been cold and clinical. The mothership was destroyed. The bombardment on Earth had been stopped. David's bravery had saved an entire planet, but at the cost of his own life. Zara had stood in the council chamber, numb and silent, as they stripped her of her rank and exiled her from the Selveni Empire. Her actions were deemed treasonous, siding with humans, destroying their own ship, and there had been no mercy. But none of that mattered. None of it compared to the hollow ache in her chest. She had never known what love truly was, not until David. His fierce loyalty, his courage, his willingness to sacrifice everything for his people, it had changed her. He had changed her, and now he was gone, or so everyone believed. But Zara had seen the signal, a faint distress call, buried deep within encrypted channels, one only someone with advanced Selveni tech could decode. It was weak and fragmented, but the message was clear. Alive, injured, need help. Her heart had nearly stopped when she saw it. It could only be him. Now, as she navigated through the remains of the mothership, hope and fear warred inside her. The ship's scanners pinged softly, locking onto a faint life sign. Zara's breath caught. "David," she whispered. She pushed the engines harder, weaving through the debris until the signal grew stronger. Ahead, a small escape pod floated, barely intact. Zara's hands moved swiftly over the controls, engaging the docking mechanism. The pod latched onto her ship with a metallic thud, and Zara rushed to the airlock. The doors hissed open, and her breath caught in her throat. David lay inside, pale and still, his uniform torn and stained with blood. But his chest rose and fell, faint and shallow, but steady. "David," she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. Her fingers brushed his face, and his skin was cold beneath her touch. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Stay with me," she whispered, activating her medkit and scanning his injuries. The readings were grim: broken ribs, internal bleeding, severe lacerations, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. As the advanced Selveni technology worked to stabilize him, his eyelids fluttered. A soft, broken sound escaped his lips. "Zara." Tears blurred her vision. "I'm here. You're safe now." It took hours of careful treatment before his breathing evened out and his color began to return. Ziara never left his side, watching over him with a fierce protectiveness she had never known she was capable of. When his eyes finally opened fully, they locked onto hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. "Hey, soldier," she whispered. His lips curved into a weak smile. "You came back." "I never left," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't." His hand found hers, his grip weak but warm. "You saved me. Again. You keep putting me in positions where I have to," she teased, but her voice trembled with emotion. He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, words became unnecessary. Everything they had fought for, everything they had lost, it all led to this. To them. Ziara leaned in, pressing her forehead to his. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," she whispered. David's breath hitched, his voice soft but certain. "Good, because I wasn't ready to say goodbye." As the ship drifted away from the wreckage, the vastness of space stretched ahead of them, unknown and full of possibilities. And for the first time, Ziara wasn't afraid. Because she wasn't alone.